All right, so this is a video about Aristotle Metaphysics, Book 4, chapters 1 through 4. So this is really where the book starts. This is where Aristotle is going to talk about his fundamental understanding of what metaphysics is, what it studies, and what kinds of principles it needs just to get started as this kind of particular philosophy. So if you look at chapter 1 in Book 4, which is just a very short paragraph, it starts by saying there is a kind of knowledge that contemplates what is insofar as it is, and what belongs to it in its own right. So a lot of times in this reading, he goes back and forth between trying to say, this is what metaphysics is studying, and also there is a knowledge of this kind of thing that it looks at, and also this knowledge is one kind of knowledge, and there's also one person, namely the philosopher, who studies it. So he goes back and forth between simply speaking about what is and what is insofar as it is, and then also like what it would mean to have a knowledge of that. So a short way of defining what metaphysics is, according to Aristotle, would be to say that it's the study of being insofar as it is being, being as being. This is a weird formulation, and this is puzzling. It almost sounds like it's tautology, like it's just saying the same thing. But if you think about what's he saying in what he is saying in chapter 1, he says other kinds of knowledge examine being, that is to say, they examine existing things, but they examine those existing things as a kind of something. So other kinds of knowledges cut off a different attribute of what is. As always, our example is math. Math investigates the being of numbers, but it does so insofar as you use them to compute and to solve problems. It doesn't think about the being of numbers specifically, except as a hypothesis. So every kind of knowledge, again, talks about being, because we're talking about what exists, what's true and not what's false, what's real and not what's fake. But we do it like as a little subset of existence. And we don't ask fundamental questions about what it means for anything at all to exist. So metaphysics studies being insofar as it exists, as it is being. Being, existence, to be, what is. In English, we're sort of stuck in all these little, these different sounding sorts of phrases. But I think being is probably the best, rather than just simply existence. Existence seems to be like more of a personal kind of thing. We talk about our own existence, or to be an existentialist. Okay, so if that's what we have to do, we have to investigate being. Take a look at chapter 2. Being is meant in more than one way, but pointing towards one meaning and some one nature, rather than ambiguously. So his examples are, every healthful thing points towards health, one thing by protecting it, another by producing it, another by being a sign of health, another because it's receptive of it. So every kind of thing that exists, like there are as many different ways of being something as there are beings, as there are different kinds of things or ways of being to exist. But it looks like there are certain patterns within all existing things that allow one specific kind of thing to be the primary instance of whatever I'm trying to talk about. And that pattern of being helps me look for the primary being, or the being that all those other ways of being are sort of pointing to or relating towards, so that I can identify what the real source of their being is. So all the healthy things, something can protect your health, like a coat. Something can produce your health, like good food. Something can be a sign of health, like that your skin looks like not chalky or too rosy, but the right color for it. That would be a sign. And another, because it's receptive of health. So what's receptive of health? Me, an organism, any organism. So all of those still depend on this one idea, this one state of being, to be healthy. And they kind of like point to whatever it would be to be or to possess health. So he wants to look for these structures of being. So we can find what most is, because that would be the thing that would be most worth knowing. We're looking for things, as he was saying in the previous, in Little Alpha Book 2, we're looking at things that are more real, more true. So all right, so if that's the case, then it's going to be a kind of knowledge to think about being insofar as it's being, but not just all existing things, but try to find the little like tight spots of being that other things seem to depend on. So okay, so if that's true, then the claim is, okay, well, there has to be one specific kind of knowing that would sort of like classify and organize all these different ways of being and these patterns within being. But then when I start to say that, and I've also said that being is meant in many ways, as many as the existing things, then the question would be, how on earth could there really be one actual knowledge of the way that everything is, or even the basic categories, just because it looks like there's so many different ways to be? And that's a real question. And I'm honestly, every time I read this, I'm not always certain he's really resolved it, but he insists. I wrote the book. Well, I'm writing my lecture notes. There is sort of one unified way of thinking about it. And one of the examples he gives at the bottom of page 54 is that there seems to be a pattern in being where to be and to be one, being and oneness, seem to always go along with one another. He says they seem to be one and the same nature, and they seem to follow one another. So that for me to say one human being and a human being is, I'm almost saying the same thing, because I can't really think of a human being without thinking of it as one thing, and that's true of everything. So if oneness really does always go along with being, every time I try to think about anything, I am thinking also as it is one, that it is one, and by means of it being one, then that would be a sort of a pattern of being that would lend me to believe that there was a kind of graspable unity that all existing things share in, that would be unified in some way. Because it's already unified. It's unified by every existing thing having some relationship to being one. So here he starts giving a few other like examples of things you can know when you know about being insofar as it's being. On page 55, it looks like you're also going to study opposites. Excuse me. And also study the negation and deprivation of being. Qualities, relations, aspects of being. He says you can have a human being and have them be a certain height or have a certain hair color. And that would be an attribute of their being, but it wouldn't be necessary to them being human. Being human doesn't have to do with a color or a height or a size. So there are going to be different aspects of being that aren't the same as what he calls an independent thing in this particular translation. Something that when I perceive it and then when I think about it, I'm taking it to be independent from others. An example, just something I could pick up or push, like this pencil. An attribute of its being would be that it's mechanical, it's yellow, it's a drafting pencil. But the independent thing here is that it's a pencil. And the same would be true of the human being. So you have independent things, and then you have aspects, qualities, relationships that they have to each other, negations of them, in things that aren't mechanical pencils, all these different things that sort of cluster around an independent object. So this kind of question is always leading us to ask, what are, for Aristotle, the primary sorts of beings? In the Plato, Socrates seemed to be claiming that the forms were the most real and the most long-lasting and the most palpable things in the entire world. Whereas for Aristotle, that's not going to be the case, because each individual thing that is an independent thing has a form, and particularly organic things seem to have a form in a way that they possess it of themselves. It's part of them. It makes them. It's the source of them. And that, to him, an independent thing, does kind of look like it is more primary in a way than just a concept of something, just an idea that someone has about something, or maybe even independent form itself. So, okay, so he's continuing to sort of like slowly sort of describe the kinds of attributes of being that would show us that this is one science. Um, there's a nice line at the bottom of 55. He says, we know opposites seem to be important to being, things like hot, cold, one and many, but there's also oppositeness itself. And he says, since oppositeness is a certain kind of difference, and difference a kind of otherness. So this is fun because we often talk about difference in many different contexts, ethical, political. But here, what you would need to be understanding would be, what's the difference between something that is other, something that's different, and something that's the opposite? Two things could be different from another without being an opposite, in opposition to each other. Like a teacup and a coffee cup are different, obviously, but they're not opposites. They seem to have a lot of uniting characteristics, not in the same way that hot and cold or light and dark seem to be opposed to each other. So then the question becomes, what is it to be an opposite? What's a difference, and what's an other? And other seems like almost a more, it's like somewhere in between difference and oppositeness, I'll say today. So the philosopher in this story that we're telling, he's the person who would care. He's the person who would sit down thinking about being insofar as it is being, and he would try to make out the difference between oppositeness, difference, and otherness. So on page 56, Aristotle seems to say that it's almost like the desire of the philosopher to know all these strange things, both from the very important and grand sounding ones, like that oneness and beingness have this relationship to each other, and then also just silly things like, what's the difference between difference and otherness? He says at 1004b, and it belongs to the philosopher to be capable of considering all things. For it does not belong to the philosopher, who will it be who examines whether Socrates and Socrates sitting down are the same, or whether one thing is contrary to one thing, or what a contrary is, or in how many ways it is met. So that's a great example. What is the difference between Socrates and Socrates sitting? Is there some kind of logical or structural difference between Socrates considered as just one human being, and then Socrates in this relationship? He's a kind of organism, a kind of being that can sit, that has a meaning, and he's qualified in some way. He is sitting, rather than when I just think of Socrates by himself. Is he sitting or standing? What does it mean? What's the difference? Is there some kind of logical or ontological way of thinking about those two relationships? So he does seem to be admitting not everybody would care, but then he also seems to be saying again and again that this is the most fundamental, the most secure, the most certain kind of knowledge that you can get to, even if it might seem at times to fall into absurdities as well as talking about grand things. He talks briefly about the difference between the philosopher and the sophist. The philosopher is the one who cares to actually get it right. The sophist in some way loves to play with contrariety, loves to play with difference, otherness, but they really are just like mess these words around and toss them around and be flamboyant about it and have fun and impress people, which sort of fun, but like also maybe it's better to try to actually figure out what's going on. So towards the end of chapter 2, he starts circling around, pointing out that this problem of oneness and manyness that we saw in the Parmenides, it really is one of the most important questions. Oneness and manyness do really seem to be fundamental to trying to talk about any being or what being itself is. All the contraries appear that we know to be important in being. It seems like they depend on oneness and manyness. to be a contrary is to be two. So to be in contradiction to something means you have a manyness there, but also that each one of those things is pointing at only one other thing. So we're still going to look, we'll still keep looking for these patterns and try to find the most important ones. Here in passing, I should point out that often you'll hear people talk about metaphysics in terms of the term ontology, O-N-T-O-L-O-G-Y. That's the noun, the adjective is ontological. That's just another way of saying something, like it's another way of describing the kind of thing that metaphysics is supposed to describe. Remember, metaphysics just talks about things that come after the natural world, so it's not a descriptive word, even though it becomes then the name for a way of thinking about the world. Whereas ontology just literally means like the study of being. So in a way, when I'm saying the ontology of something is so and so, that contrariety is important to it, then I am just sort of giving you a reality map, an attempt to describe a reality map of how the world is, the structures of its isness. So that's, I think, a helpful distinction for you. So now let's go to chapter 3. And I'm gonna, in this video now,